Our first speakers are from the United States. The first speaker is Suzanne Conklin Akbari. She is professor of medieval studies at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. She studies and teaches the literature and history of Europe and wider Mediterranean region, extending into the Islamic world and the Horn of Africa. Ian McCallum is a member of Munsee-Delaware First Nation. He works with his community promoting culture and history and is an educator working with the Munsee language. As a PhD student at the University of Toronto, Ian is currently researching strategies to support Munsee language revitalization. And finally, Melissa Moreton. She is a research associate at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton School of Historical Studies. She is a codicologist and scholar of the history of the book, who is particularly interested in material culture and the development and exchange of manuscript technologies across Eurasia, Africa, and the Americas. She works on projects relating to global book history and indigenous language and cultural revitalization. Susan, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Can you hear me well?
Yes, thank you.
I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers for inviting us. We're honored to begin this lecture series sponsored by the Belgian-Dutch Bookbindings Society and the Consortium for European Research Libraries. It's not every day that we have the opportunity to present to an audience of book historians and practitioners. In the first section of our presentation, I'll offer a brief overview of the methodology we've developed in our project, which is called Hidden Stories, New Approaches to the Local and Global History of the Book. Generously funded by the Mellon Foundation, this is a 4-year project that runs through the end of 2026 and is located at the University of Toronto with a secondary home at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. After that brief overview, I'll turn to the main focus of our presentation, which centers on one of our 9 research areas, namely the Great Lakes and Eastern Woodlands of North America, with a particular emphasis on our collaborations with Lenape or Delaware community members. While this research field is significant in itself, it also offers methodological insights concerning collaboration, relationality, and the status of the book that inform our project as a whole. In the second section of this presentation, Ian McCallum will discuss his and his community's visit with the Lenape-related books at Princeton University Library, and Princeton is situated on traditional Lenape lands. Ian will specifically explore the unfolding research around an early modern printed and bound copy of Buxtorf's Lexicon, which is covered with a brain-tanned and painted beaver skin, perhaps repurposed from a piece of Lenape clothing in the mid-1700s. Ian is a member of Munsee-Delaware Nation, which is today located in Ontario, Canada. He's a language keeper and activist for Indigenous language revitalization, and I'm sure he'll introduce himself in the way that seems good to him more fully. In the third part of the talk, Hidden Stories Research Associate Melissa Moreton will discuss the material aspects of the beaverskin covered book and the role of traditional Lenape craftspeople. Because she's a codicologist and historian of the book, Melissa will examine the physical aspects of the binding and overcover, connecting the materials to craft practices and traditional tanning techniques and binding techniques. Finally, she will introduce another Indigenous book connected to the Hidden Stories project, an Anishinaabe birchbark book with quillwork covers dating to 1859 from the Shawniga First Nation community in Ontario, Canada. Melissa will contextualize that book within a larger genre of Anishinaabe birchbark books from North America. Like the beaverskin-covered Buxtorf's Lexicon, it is a belonging that sits in both Indigenous and settler colonial spaces. The Hidden Stories Project is a 4-year collaborative initiative which will continue, as I mentioned, through the end of 2026. It's phase 2 of an earlier Mellon-funded project called The Book and the Silk Roads, which aimed to tell the story of the book, but to do it in a different way. Our core research team wanted to counter the standard narrative that runs from the early Christian Codex to Gutenberg's Bible to the digital age. So we began to assemble a network of collaborators who were working on the history of the book within a wide range of cultural environments. Islamic manuscripts from North Africa, Kashmiri manuscripts from South Asia, Chinese print materials from Dunhuang, and many more. We learned so much during the first phase of our project, The Book and the Silk Roads, especially in terms of methodology. We found that we could assemble experts in a kind of virtual circle around a book or a small collection of related books, and then carry out a cross-cutting workshop that will allow us to reach comparative conclusions, and to gain new insights into the history of the book. One of these workshops centered on birch bark as a global book material. Next slide, please, Melissa. And it brought together knowledge keepers from Indigenous North America, as well as South Asian, European, and North American scholars of early Buddhist texts, which were written on Himalayan birch bark. Another of our workshops centered on the role of textiles in manuscripts, as part of the binding, covering an illuminated image, and so on. Choosing a single writing substrate, such as birch bark, or a single feature of bookbindings, such as textiles, as the ground for a comparative study across geographical areas has revealed unexpected connections across bookmaking traditions, areas of scholarship, and ways of knowing. This approach was extremely fruitful, and its impact has had a slow but steady ripple effect on our work. It's led to collaborative research on an Anishinaabe birch bark book, which Melissa will discuss briefly today, as well as a future volume that will bring together interdisciplinary essays exploring a range of global birch bark traditions. Over years of collaborative work, we have learned that we are not so much ourselves telling the story of the book as we're trying to create the conditions for the book to, so to speak, tell its own hidden story. We've increasingly come to see the book as itself a relative or a relation, following the guidance of Korean Métis archivist Jessie Lawyer, and to place it at the center of our inquiry, not as the passive object of examination, but as itself animate and connected to its community, not just the people who made and originally used it, but those who continue to be in relation with the book until the present day. The Hidden Stories Project includes a total of 9 geographical areas. Some of these areas are extremely well established within our project, having been an area of focus since the beginning. Ethiopia and coastal East Africa is a good example of this. Others are still in the process of development, such as Mesoamerica and Mexico. While there are 9 geographical areas of focus in the Hidden Stories Project, the Great Lakes and Eastern Woodlands area has been important to us in a more foundational way with regard to our own institutional situatedness. That is, the collaborative study with Indigenous communities that are connected to the land on which our academic institutions are situated has required us to ground the project as a whole on these relationships, which has influenced our working methods throughout. Collaborating with Indigenous communities of origin has proven to be different in some ways from working with other communities of origin. Our collaboration with communities of origin also often involves those in the global diaspora. For example, here we see a graduate student at the University of Toronto from the diasporic Tibetan community studying a Tibetan Buddhist manuscript. Working with communities of origin in the Great Lakes and Eastern Woodlands area, however, has been quite different. First of all, as I already mentioned, there are obligations and responsibilities that fall to us, whether in Toronto or here in Princeton, arising from the land we live and work on. Beyond this, it is important to note that our involvement with Indigenous communities of origin was not motivated by the Hidden Stories project area, but instead converged with existing work. That is, it generated the project area. We'd been working with Ian and other Lenape community members on language reclamation and historical work for a few years before it occurred to us in the second project phase to connect these two initiatives. In short, it was essential to have a substantial long-term relationship with the community in order to establish a level of reciprocity and mutual trust where shared work on book history could begin. Next slide. Another project area that has been substantially affected by our collaborations with Indigenous communities of origin concerns book science, which I'll mention today only very briefly. You might think that in a project such as this, we might have scientists and engineers way over here and community engagement way over here. In other words, keeping these different ways of interacting with the book far apart. This is exactly what we are not doing. Our working method places the book as the center of study, with all of those who bring their specialized knowledge to the book gathered literally or figuratively around it. Analysis of pigments, inks, writing substrates, textiles, organic materials, and so on are carried out only when and if we have established a relationship with the community of origin, although the nature of that relationship formation looks different depending on which geographical area we're talking about. This focus on community-led decision-making also extends to digitizing, cataloging, and access to library materials. And in collaboration with Princeton University Library, we've done some work in this area in partnership with Lenape community members. And I'll just mention briefly a co-written article that Ian, Melissa, our colleague Anu Vedantam, and myself recently published in a special issue of the journal Library Trends on Indigenous librarianship. And while that work might seem far from our fundamental focus on global book history, maximizing access to material and data in archives and libraries for communities of origin is a fundamental ethical commitment of our research. Community priorities are also project priorities. So having learned this from our work with Lenape and Anishinaabe communities, we can apply this same ethical principle to working with all communities of origin, while also respecting their differences. Before we turn to a discussion of the beaverskin covered and other Indigenous books, I'd like to give a very brief overview of Lenape communities to provide a context for the analysis that follows, and bearing in mind that some will be more familiar and some will be less familiar with the Indigenous communities of North America. As you probably know, the kinds of terms that are sometimes used include Native American in the US and First Nation in Canada. More accurate and preferred usage, though, is to name the specific tribal nation wherever possible. In the case of Lenape communities, this is complicated because while Lenape or Delaware people come from one contiguous territory, which you can see here on the map, which includes all of the state of New Jersey and surrounding region, the majority of Lenape people live elsewhere, with widely dispersed Lenape tribal nations currently located in Ontario, Canada, as well as in Wisconsin and Oklahoma in the United States. Complicating things further, that is the fact that some of these are federally recognized by either Canada or the US, while others are only recognized at the state level. Additional Lenape communities that lack either state or federal recognition, but are nonetheless well documented, exist in Kansas as well as Pennsylvania and New Jersey. The name Delaware is an exonym, that is a name that has been used for Lenape people by British colonial governments based on reasons that have to do with the colonial administration. And colonial administrators often referred to Delaware Indians, by which they meant the indigenous people living along the Delaware River. Lenape people also lived along the Hudson River, which marks the border between New York and New Jersey. The language spoken in this region is referred to as Lenape, which can be spelled differently depending on whether you're using Munsee language, which is spoken in the northern part of this territory, including the Hudson River Valley and northern Delaware River region, or Wenami language, which was spoken in the southern part of the territory. Munsee and Lenape are two closely related languages rather than dialects, and these in turn are closely related to other languages of the region, such as Mohican and Nanticoke. And Munsee in particular has been used to help revive these, so to speak, sleeping languages. And I've outlined this complex set of relationships because the complexity of this context is very necessary to understand to come to grip with the collaborations we've been engaged in. That is, it's not a straightforward process. There are multiple Lenape communities, and each one stands in a relationship to the others. Each one has undergone a process of what is sometimes called the Lenape diaspora. And here you can see just one example. It's an outline of the forced removal of the Stockbridge Munsee band of Mohican Indians, currently located in Wisconsin. I won't go through the details of removal, but similar trajectories took Lenape communities to Kansas and then Oklahoma, as well as Ontario by way of Ohio and New York State. In some cases, it's a pretty clear-cut process to establish a collaborative research project with an Indigenous nation. There's a sort of governmental structure in the nation to facilitate that. In other cases, it's more complicated. For us, the relationships are grounded in collaboration with traditional language keepers from across the different communities, keeping a priority and a focus on the reclamation and revival of Munsee language. So turning now to our local collaborations between Munsee community members and faculty and students in Princeton, I'd like to emphasize how we're situating our work in a very local way, acknowledging Lenape land. As I mentioned, the Hidden Stories Project is co-located at the University of Toronto in Canada and at IAS in the United States. So the land that these institutions inhabit comes with a set of relationships and responsibilities. So the grounding in the local that's fundamental to our project doesn't just pertain to the specific geographical areas of study. It also pertains to the land of our institutions. And that guides our working methods. And next slide, please, Melissa. It would take a long time to describe in detail the Lenape collaborations that have been going on at Princeton over the last several years. So I'll just say that they're ongoing and increasingly robust. This past fall featured this coming fall, will feature our 5th annual Munsee Language and History Symposium, as well as the first gathering of Wenami language keepers this spring, in a gradual widening of the circle of Lenape community participants, keeping language reclamation at the center of the activity. Land, language, and culture are intricately connected, and rebuilding land-based connections with Lenape communities, both Munsee and Wenami, is central to this larger work. Next slide, please. Community visits with Lenape-related books have been an important part of the annual Munsee Language and History Symposium, and Princeton University Library has been an essential partner. Community members have spent a lot of time with books related to Lenape language and history in special collections over the last 4 years. Next slide. For Munsee-Delaware communities, Indigenous language reclamation and revitalization is a top priority, so it is also a top priority in our Hidden Stories project. Supporting language work both contributes directly to our research with collaborative study of lexicons created by missionaries embedded in Lenape communities being used for language revitalization, and indirectly in building up a mutual relationship that can grow over time. In the first phase of our work, our map and our research scope included Eurasia plus North and East Africa. Over the last few years, however, we've gotten into a position where we're able to widen that scope, including books such as this one. Next slide. A book bound in brain-tanned animal skin made by Lenape community members who live not far from what is now Princeton, New Jersey. So I'd like to now turn this discussion over to Ian McCallum. And Ian may not be able to use his camera because the internet connectivity is a little bit unstable where he is. Thank you.
Nishik, Suzanne, thank you, Suzanne. I'm hoping everybody can hear me. Nishik. As Suzanne mentioned, I do live in central Ontario, and currently we are receiving a lot of snow. So I'm going to keep my camera off for the balance of my presentation just so that people can hear me. I will leave my camera on though, just to do an introduction in the Munsee language that Suzanne was so kind to mention in the first slides. So I'll provide a greeting. Wailaknaya Powney. Good morning, everyone. Ni Dashinzi Ian. My name is Ian. Ni Nonjai Nalahi. And I'm from up the river, or Munsee-Delaware Nation is my home community here in Ontario. So as Suzanne noted, the beaverskin covered book has been part of an ongoing series of visits and conversations. And I must admit, when I first came to visit the book, there's no personal connection to it. It's been something that has been at a distance from our community, but it provides that sort of stimulus for looking at it in terms of historical culture, value, connection to language, and it stimulates a lot of questions such as, was it a gift to the person who put it on a book that's clearly not from Lenape culture? Who actually made the item? And then it also provided a sort of a longer view, seeing as a longer relationship in terms of research. So while I had the opportunity to view the book back in 2021 with former Chief Mark Peters, since that time, many more people from my community and other Munsee communities in both Ontario and the United States have been able to visit this book. So it's not just a couple of people who come to see it, but it's actually quite a number of people now have been able to see it. It's almost like a crowdsourcing research. The covering the immediate questions initially involving the color pattern that is viewed on the beaver skin, and initial thoughts. Red and black do figure quite prominently in Munsee religion as well as ceremony. Was the item a repurposed item from another piece of clothing or something other to that effect? Also the pattern, so the creation of triangles in the orange or the red or the black lines led to some initial thoughts that perhaps that refers to some of the mountainous region in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, and that perhaps those straight lines might refer to the ocean. But that's only speculation, and those are the conversations that happen when community has the opportunity to come to Princeton to view the materials that are in the library. Next slide, please. So in terms of the book, before it came to have this cover, we know it as a Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon printed in Basel, Switzerland in 1645. It was owned by the 18th century Presbyterian minister David Brainerd, who lived from 1718 to 1747, and who spent the latter part of his life embedded in the Lenape towns of Cranberry and Crosswicks. which is located east and south of Princeton. And the map is there for the reference. The book came into Princeton's library through Jonathan Edwards, who was a Presbyterian minister and theologian, who was a close associate of David Brainerd, and who became the president of Princeton College in 1758. Edwards wrote a biography of Brainerd after his early death, which took place in Edwards' own home. And this account attributes to the relic-like status of the book as a memento of Brainerd and his Christian mission to the Indians. And I think what's very interesting from a Munsee perspective is that, Munsee people would have seen David carrying this book around as he was active in these two communities. It raises important research questions with regard to language. Clearly, Brainerd spoke Munsee language to provide that way to interact and convert, but also did his contemporaries at that time speak the language? So there are other non-Munsee people who spoke the language. What other resources have been created that might have provided important building blocks for history and language understanding? So that's something that, as a community historian, that's what I'm looking for. So we go sideways, where we have a book that has a cover that may have been a gift from a Lenape person, to now, are there other resources that we can use to sort of provide some knowledge in the gaps that we have in terms of our own long-standing history? Having the opportunity to visit the book also allows for new perspectives. And it's interesting that both the animal skin and the book in the Munsee language, if we were to translate both, are animate. So there's an animacy going on with both the book and the skin that covers it. And then as well, it's also the relationship with the land, of course, because the beaver skin clearly meant that that beavers were part of the trade system, but also part of the the clothing for the Munsee people in New Jersey. Next slide, please. So Brainerd is often depicted surrounded by Native Americans, though always in a generic and inaccurate way, not as Lenape people with a specific culture or an individualized level that Brainerd is afforded. There are often a backdrop to mythologize him. Images of Brainerd are usually show him with a book, not surprising given his history as a preacher and his later cult-like status among evangelical missionaries. Depictions of Brainerd position as synonymous with the book as a symbol of conversation, which further complicates the beaver skin covered lexicon now at the Princeton University Library. This book and others are viewed quite differently from an Indigenous perspective. They were tools for forced Christian conversion, but also belonging that might hold Lenape language or a Lenape presence in their materiality or text. So the wrapping of this book with a Lenape painted beaver skin creates an object or belonging with a complex history, one that is at once European and colonial settler and Indigenous. It represents in some ways the complex relationship between two very different communities. And then the conversation with Munsee people using to conduct their daily lives. It's a mixed blessing having this book and having a resource, because while there may be a wealth of written information that can support those missing gaps in history and language, as I mentioned, it did come at the expense of traditional ways of learning and the transmission of knowledge. The need to convert also worked to divide communities, and that's very much still felt in contemporary times. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned a little bit a while ago, visiting of the book as part of a larger community during our annual Munsee Symposium gatherings has been valuable. So again, it's not just myself or former Chief Mark Peters visiting book, but we have people coming from different Munsee communities who can now visit and sort of provide their feedback and weigh in on what they think. So our elders, language keepers, and community members have commented on the significance of the red, black, and white painted lines and how the covering might be meaningful in a relationship to the subject matter of the book. The Lenape community members who gather around the book descend from people who painted and sewed this covering, and a result, we recognize the person who made it as well as the book itself as our relative. Next slide, please. So a brief piece about the actual skin of the book. The North American beaver, or in the Munsee language, we know it as a moch. The audience will be familiar with the English word beaver since it comes from the Dutch word. The origin of the term meaning brown, probably referring to its brown coat. The Eurasian beaver was hunted to extinction in some areas of Europe and near extinction in others to feed sort of the demand for fur. Beaver pelts were waterproof, dense, and durable, and the undercoat was coveted for making felt hats. It was also hunted by Europeans for castrum, produced from its scent glands and used in perfume making and for medicinal purposes. So before the arrival of the Europeans, the beaver population in North America was upwards of 400 million. It's not surprising, given its decimation across Eurasia, that the North American beaver suffered the same fate as the Eurasian beaver, once Europeans decided to settle in North America. It is said that the Dutch were searching for new trade routes to Asia when they came to Eastern North America, but that they stayed for the beaver. The beaver was eradicated from this area that is today New Jersey by 1900. The central importance of the beaver to Dutch and European settlers is clearly visible on the maps of the period, and the beaver is a central feature of the seal of New Netherlands. So it does, the skin on the book does provide that understanding of a different time period where beaver would have been readily accessible by the First Nations communities, the Munsee communities of New Jersey, as an option for both for clothing, but also in this case, a covering for a book. Next slide, please. So as these details from the 17th and early 18th century maps of New Netherlands show, the beaver was depicted as being so abundant that the supply was seemingly unlimited. Hunted to near extinction in Europe by the time settlers arrived in North America, it must have seemed incredible to find the beaver in this new land. For the Dutch, the value of the beaver was in that it was a trade commodity. For Indigenous communities, it has a range of meanings and values. Millennial of Indigenous land stewardship maintain these healthy populations, and Indigenous people have always lived in a balanced relationship with animals. From the perspective of a Lenape person, and thinking of the beaver whose skin came to be made from clothing repurposed for Brainerd's book, I think about the animal relative and ancestors who came into relationship with it. So to provide a bit more context for that, in most First Nation communities, Indigenous communities, we have a clan system. And clans are typically based off of animals, reptiles. For myself, I follow the ways of the turtle clan. So when you take an animal's life, you're taking something that is on equal status as yourself. So Indigenous people are not above that which is around us, and that goes for plants and trees. We're all in relationship with each other, and as well as a member of the turtle clan, I cannot take another my clan member's life. So I cannot take a turtle's life. I have to be gifted a turtle shell from perhaps a member of another clan. So that's some of the internal unwritten rules of how we work with the animals or the reptiles that represent us as families. So in terms of the beaver, one might propose that this skin may have been given to Brainerd by someone who was not from that clan, as well as in another situation, if an otter pelt was used, that a member of the otter clan could not give that to Brainerd as well. Now, this is speculation 350 years later. However, we're working off that sort of traditional understanding within community of how things are gifted and the appropriate way we work in relationship with the land and animals surrounding us, to provide that guidance in a modern sense. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Melissa Moreton.
Anashik, Ian. So we have this book. It was printed in 1645 in Basel, and then it's covered sometime around the 1740s with this Lenape painted beaverskin cover. And in 1844, there was a newspaper that printed a piece about this book, mentioning it and saying that it was an odd and curious book bound by the Indians he lived among, talking about Brainerd, with a piece of otter skin painted in their peculiar style. And so this was a question for early researchers on the book. And today it's possible to determine the animal origin of skin. So was it a beaver? Was it an otter? Using a process pioneered by the Beasts to Crafts project. This is a non-destructive process called e-zooms, and it takes a rubbing from the skin and processes it using proteomic testing to determine the animal origin for materials like parchment, leathers, tanned and taut skins, as well as adhesives such as hide glue. So when our community collaborations on this book began in 2021, we discovered that Princeton University Library had already 2 years earlier sent out the material for testing, including this proteomic analysis and pigment analysis as well, using X-ray fluorescence. At the request of researcher Dr. Steffi Diepold, and we would not have done such an analysis without community consultation, but it had already been done, and so we shared the results with that were shared with us by Princeton University Library with Lenape community members. And the pigments analysis indicated that the red was a mercury sulfide or vermilion, the black was a carbonized bone, and the white may have been a bone or shell white. And this is consistent of what we know of traditional usage on similar painted items, such as clothing and ceremonial items. So in terms of the skin material for the overcover, the original eZooms data set focused on sort of common book-related skins such as calf, sheep, and goat. So not otter and beaver. Those things were not in the database because most European books are in the former category of skins using those. So they weren't definitive about what the results were, but they said it was possibly beaver with traces of horse, which was likely from the hide. I think it's from the hide glue used as a binder for the painted pigments. But by 2023, the eZooms dataset had been expanded to include a wider range of animal protein profiles. And this was at the request of some of this research that we were doing, working with Sarah Fidiment, who had done the original testing and been one of the people that co-developed the eZooms method. And she confirmed that the skin was beaver. So they basically took the data set and added it to the eZooms data set, and because it's an existing data set of animal proteins. And so it may sound like a curiosity sort of to determine, you know, like, is the skin on the overcover on Brainerd's book otter or beaver? But as Ian has just elaborated on, from an Indigenous perspective, each animal is uniquely situated as an other than human relative and inhabiting a really specific space in Lenape cosmology, and especially regard to creation stories and clan connections and responsibilities. So in this case, it's a very important question, and one with community consent we would want to pursue further and find out if it's beaver or otter, and it is indeed beaver. So since the beaver appears to be a brain tan skin, I'll discuss briefly the process of brain tanning. So brain tanning is one of several techniques that falls under the category of fat or oil tanning. And it is an indigenous process, and it's one that's developed independently by early people across the world. So you find it in lots of different cultures. It was not commonly used, though, in early modern Europe, but it was and still is used today as a process that's intimately connected and tied to indigenous communities across Turtle Island, which is North America. So it is what it is not. It is not leather. Leather is processed with tannic acids from plants, and brain tanning is a fat, again, or oil tan process. Soap or egg can be used to the same effect. Other names for brain tan skin that you might be familiar with are chamois, wash leather, or buckskin. And in fact, the buckskin does not refer, as many think, to the male deer or buck, or the animal origin of the skin, but rather to the bucking process that's part of brain tanning. So if I call something a buckskin, it doesn't mean it's a deer. It just means that, well, technically it's a brain tan skin. We don't know what type. So brain tanning creates a really fabric-like material used for clothing and drums and ceremonial purposes. It's very absorbent, and it can be wet and dry and still retain its soft, supple quality, versus leather and other skins, which will shrink and dry hard if they come in contact with water. So this is a really important aspect of knowing about the quality of the skin. So brain tanning involves soaking the skin in a brain solution, which is rich in lipids and fats, and wringing and stretching and working that skin until it's dry, and replacing basically the mucus between the collagen fibers with fats, which makes it incredibly supple, and it keeps that both absorbent quality, but also one that's not going to harden once it's dry. So in general, I would say brain tanning is, well, it's at the highest level of animal skin processing. And then beaver is like the most high level. And so in the tanners I've talked to, they refer to beaver as river cow, because not because of any relation to a cow, but because of its thick skin, which keeps it warm and does all sorts of important things for these animals that do not hibernate in the winter and live in these very cold areas in Turtle Island, across Turtle Island. So that does make it a very challenging skin to tan. And so when I look at this, and again, knowing that it's beaver, again, is a very important aspect of understanding the maker. I'm in awe of the maker who made this very fine beaver skin, brain tan beaver skin. The final option in brain tanning is smoking. So to smoke the skin, what that does is it locks in the skin's ability to be wet and dried, and it actually it creates aldehydes in the skin, which lock in that quality. So smoke is also a wonderful pest deterrent, and it has an enjoyable and comforting smell to humans generally, that kind of campfire smell. I'm not sure if this skin was smoked though, and so often you can still smell the smoke on a skin, especially brain tanned skins. And I haven't smelled that on this skin. And so if you don't smoke it, it is incredibly white, like an alum taw skin. It is blindingly white. You can see a little bit in these pictures here. And so I'm just wondering, since this is several hundred years old, this skin, so 1740s, if the skin was not smoked and painted on, and in that case, it could have been used for ceremonial purposes, because it's very bright and white, and it is maybe something that you wouldn't be out in the rain. It's not your everyday buckskin, basically. So that's a question I have as well. Just a quick note on the repairs that the tanner made. So I was curious about these, and these are definitely done when wet, because you can see this kind of zigzag configuration, which you see in parchment and other things that are done by the tanner when it's wet. So I love just these little marks that show us, oh, this is the mark of the hand of the person that did it. So again, the mark of the maker's hand in the overcovers is really wonderful. So overcovers were added to books that broke, basically, and there's some sort of structural failure. Fat books classically break in the middle because there's just too much for certain bindings, and Buxtorf's Lexicon is a fat little book, I can tell you, and you can kind of see it just from the dimensions here. But other examples of the same edition broke in the same place. So I was kind of curious, like, oh, wait, there's obviously hundreds of these out there. And if they're in your collections too, please do send me photos of the covers. But this one broke right down the middle. I'm not sure what kind of binding that is. It looked like a kind of pasteboard binding, which makes sense. But curiously, these other copies did not, and those are parchment covered. They're non-adhesive on the spine. So that makes me wonder if this kind of like adhesion to the spine, the way the original European leather binding on this book was here, stresses out the spine in some ways, and that these parchment bindings, this one looks sort of contemporary to the period, this one looks later, but it's curious to see kind of like when in other cases, did it break or did it not? Here you can see the break exactly in the spine, but also along the spine edge here, the user has made repairs along the spine with some thread. And I'm wondering, you know, to me, in my mind, it was made by a woman, because this is somebody who would have been skilled in sewing and clothing making, and been able to adapt, you know, the skills that she had to this little body of the book, which is what I think of it as. It is considered a relation, an ancestor for the Lenape people. And so it's not a far reach for us to imagine that. You think of it as a book, and we do have names like that, as you know, as bookbinders, head and tail and spine and you know, all the parts of the book have these kind of body names. When I look at these folk repairs also, I want to say that I don't think of them as kind of sad. You know, a lot of people look at folk repairs and they're, you know, things that are done by the user as kind of sad or quaint. And I just think like this increases the value of the book, because it means that it was so highly valued that the user, with the skills that they had, adapted them to create this thing that was going to prolong the life of this book. And because it was valued by the community. And so this is an important part of the way that I think about these. Now this one, you know, I don't think it was, I can say that it was not done by a professional binder because of the way that the mitering was done on the spine. Here on the right, you can see that the spine width was miscalculated. So there's a first cut here, because the spine always looks narrower than it is when you actually put the book cover on. And having taught bookbinding for 12 years, this is like a classic beginner binder mistake. So like, as you know, like measuring the width of the spine takes some skill. You only do this once though, and then you remember not to do it again. But what she's done here is then make a second cut where the hinge is, and been able to then put it on the book. But that first cut's still there, and it's just part of the story of the book. It's part of the history of the book. Another thing I wanted to note are the overcovers, the sewing and the zigzag tension sewing. And in conversation with Suzanne and Ian, we've kind of noted this over the, you know, as the research has been unfolding. And the research on overcovers, which again are often put on books that are broken to preserve them. There's some similar books with zigzag overcover sewing. The one on the right on the top is a book by Peter Jones, who was a Mississauga of the Credit First Nation missionary. And this particular book has annotations in it that discuss his traveling between communities in Ontario, missionizing. But curiously, same zigzag tension sewing. And then I found also a lexicon, Greek and Latin lexicon from 1738. So it was printed in the same period that the overcover was put on the book on the left, the Buxtorf lexicon. This one has a Todd skin overcover. I think about, you know, and Suzanne and Ian and I have talked about this. It does have that, you know, Suzanne mentioned it, kind of like the way a drum is drummed onto a drum head. And so it's sort of tempting to think like, oh, this is some indigenous application of tensioning, which it totally would be. I mean, it's a way that drums would have been put on, including drums made with brain tan skin, the water drums. But we see so many overcovers that are drummed on like this that it's much more likely a common early American, or just kind of something that would be familiar to a layperson who's not a binder. And that is just something, because these covers are non-adhesive, they're not glued on. There has to be some way to keep the cover on, because you're not gluing these turn-ins down here. So you have to find some way laterally and vertically to keep the tension. So this is the answer, zigzag tension sewing, and we see it on most of the overcovers that have been documented. So it's a very common non-adhesive way to put this on. So, and as we get more, you know, as Ian and Suzanne and I always talk about, the Buxtorf Lexicon has brought other books to us. So it's become like this way of bringing relations, widening the circle of relations, basically. So finally, I want to turn to the Indigenous birch bark books. This is the Anishinaabe Masina Igas, which just means little Anishinaabe book. And it was written and illustrated by Solomon James, chief of the Shawniga First Nation, which is in Georgian Bay, around Georgian Bay in Ontario. Not too far actually from where Ian is right now. And it was made for his son, little talking bird, Louis James, so in 1859. So he's the chief. He goes out to his community, and the women in the community are expert in Ontario, the Anishinaabe community. These are Ojibwe people. They're expert birch bark and basket making people. And so he just probably asked them, make me a book with this on the title, and that he was going to illustrate it and write in it for his son to teach him the Odawa language, which is Eastern Ojibwe. It's got porcupine quills that are colored on the cover, which is also a very high level of skill that these Anishinaabe women have, even still today. It's edged with sweetgrass, which is very common, and quills, colored quills. So this is now part of the Coats and Children's collection, which is like a whole other story that I won't get into. But just to say that this is within a genre of books that were produced at the period. And so with the disenfranchisement of Indigenous communities, the Indian agents then went to community members and said, why don't you make these cute little books for the white tourists in the Ontario cottage district of Muskoka, and you can sell these. And so we actually have a lot of these books. And if anyone knows of any in collections that you're familiar with, please do get in touch with us, because we're building a database around these. And these are just some examples of ones that I found. I was in Chicago this week, and this was my find at the Newberry Library. So they date to different periods in the 18th and 1900s, and even in collections in Europe. So they're all over North America and European collections. This one at the bottom is from the Center for the Study of Manuscript Cultures in Hamburg. So Indigenous crafts, ingenuity, you know, resilience within, you know, these are all themes within colonial settler disenfranchisement. These are all themes that, again, we're coming up again and again. And I just want to close out by kind of coming back to these community collaborations that we're working on. So the groups gathered around the book grew out of the connections that were made during the 2022 Birch Bark Workshop that Suzanne mentioned at the start of the talk, and really wanting to connect this book with community. So I traveled to Georgian Bay near Shawniga to present on it. And then since then, we've been building relationships with Shawniga people, and Maria Hupfield, who's an Anishinaabe community member from a community nearby, is going to come with Shawniga visitors to Princeton this year to visit with the book. And so as the conversations grow, other project areas will come out from that, perhaps an exhibit, with new work being produced by Indigenous artists in response to the Anishinaabe Masina Igas. So yeah, so just kind of centering this book at the center of conversations as a relation, and thinking about how its story is continuing with new work. Anurshik, thank you.